All right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming on this Thursday afternoon. And it's good to see so many familiar names. And thanks for coming. We're going to be talking about old growth, and I'm Eddie Petryshen. I'm the conservation specialist with Wildsight, based here in Kimberley, in the territory of the Ktunaxa Nation. And I feel fortunate to live and work in Amakas Ktunaxa with the people and nation who have lived in relation and stewarded all living things for millennia. And as an organization, Wildsight works to protect wildlife, water, and wild places in Columbia, or in Canada's Columbia and Rocky Mountain region. And we're going to be talking about kind of the broader Columbia Basin and old growth within those systems. And, this is a region that encompasses the traditional territory of Ktunaxa, the Sinixt, the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation, and the Claytene. And I'm really grateful to those nations who have stewarded and are actively stewarding these lands since time immemorial. And I want to just honor and acknowledge that deep-seated connection to these territories, and that through it all, these Indigenous nations have continued to practice culture and steward their territories. I wanted to start with this poem by Gary Snyder. And to me, this poem speaks to how civilization after civilization continues to make the same historic mistakes. And we do it in the name of progress. We do it in the name of the economy, and we do it because we lack the radical imagination to shift economies and to learn from the many nations who have lived in a reciprocal relationship with the natural world. And I think it speaks to where we are in BC right now. And the poem goes, "The ancient forests of China logged, and the hills slipped into the yellow sea. Squared beams, log dogs, on a tamped earth sill. San Francisco 2x4s were the woods around Seattle. Someone killed and someone built a house. A forest, wrecked or raised, all America hung on a hook and burned by men in their own praise. And again, cut down, grows of Ahab, of Sabeel, pines, knob twigs, thick cone and seed. Sabeel's tree, this, sacred and grows." But I also think that, that kind of speaks to a shifting baseline, right? And every generation has gotten more comfortable with less abundance in terms of the natural world. And I'm here in the Columbia Basin, an ecosystem that was once arguably the most productive salmon fishery or amongst the most productive salmon fisheries in North America. And we don't have salmon in the upper Columbia system due to dams. And we've gone from a province that was once, majority old growth or primary forest to a province that is now clear cut or managed forest. And I'm sitting here looking out at the southern Purcell Mountains, where 3 years ago, there were still caribou roaming the ridgelines of the southern Purcells. Now there is not. And as humans, we're hardwired to adjust to change. And I think the lesson there is, if we're not paying attention to what's happening with the natural world around us, our baseline shifts to this new normal. And I wanted to talk just briefly about the American chestnut. It's a hardwood tree native to eastern and southern North America that now is virtually extinct. And the Appalachian regions had a lot of these big chestnut trees. And I think the story of the chestnut tree is a cautionary tale. It's a story of logging and disease, and how those two things can come together when you push planetary and ecosystem boundaries. And there's just a few shots of those chestnut ecosystems. And right now in BC, we are pushing boundaries, and we're entering into an unprecedented time in terms of our ecosystems, which up until this point have largely been affected by human land use, and our ecosystems are now being impacted and fundamentally changed by climate change as well. So it's really that cumulative pressure that we're going to see moving forward, and it requires precautionary management. And why I'm speaking about the American chestnut is that we need to learn from history. We need to be precautionary about risk. Yeah. And when it comes to old growth, people often get stuck on numbers. And I think that's often the wrong argument, whether it's 3% or 6% of our productive old growth that's remaining, it's still a tiny, tiny fraction of what was there originally. And that's the important thing. And as we push our ecosystems more to the brink, it's extremely risky. And it's like a game of Jenga. You might be able to get away with logging that forest over there, but you pull one piece out from the bottom and the whole tower can come down. And that's what happens with ecosystems or species. You don't know when you hit that tipping point. But the more you stack the tower, the more we stack the tower, the higher the risk. And we're seeing that with species, with caribou. We've lost 5 populations here in the Columbia Basin since 2014. Our salmon, across the province, bull trout, fisher in the southern interior. These really, indicator or keystone species that we're pushing to the brink. Okay, old growth. How to define old growth? And I really like this statement from Gary Merkel and Al Gorley in the Old Growth Strategic Review. In many ways, old growth is in the eye of the beholder. If we mean old forest, then we need to recognize that nearly all of British Columbia's forest and a host of species and ecosystem services have evolved within ecosystems that have been developing since glaciation. And although trees die and regrow, most areas have continuously been occupied by forest. But it just speaks to the fact that it's not a hard line definition with old growth. And a specific age-based number does not fully represent what old growth is, because old growth is a structural state, and just because you cross an age-based threshold does not mean that forest has old growth characteristics, which I'm going to be speaking about. So old growth in primary forests, and a lot of people are increasingly and globally moving to the term primary forest, and a forest that has existed since ancient times or has remained relatively undisturbed by human activity. And this applies to a broader stretch of or swath of the province. Old growth, there's not one single definition. It depends, and as that statement illustrates, it can be subjective. But what I'm going to be focusing on today is mainly old growth characteristics. And just on a global perspective, these are relatively recent numbers. There's about 1.1 billion hectares of primary forest remaining. May sound like a lot, but it's not a lot compared to what was historically here. Brazil, Canada, and Russia host the vast, vast majority of the world's primary forest. And, we have a global responsibility here. The area of primary forest across the world has decreased by 81 million hectares since 1990. But increasingly, the rate of global primary forest loss has halved between 2010 and 2020 compared with the previous decade. But that's not because of BC or Canada. You know, in the 1990s, the Pacific Northwest largely ended the practice of logging ancient giants on public land. And in the US, what's often referred to as the Timber Wars. And 2001, the state of Western Australia banned the logging of old growth forests. 2002, New Zealand banned the logging of irreplaceable old growth forests on public land. Last year, Western Australia announced a ban on all primary forest logging by 2024. So increasingly, there's a global movement for not only old growth, but primary forest. And in BC, we're one of the last jurisdictions really going hard on our logging our irreplaceable old growth forest. And I just want to focus a little bit on the first places that are typically logged and what has been the focus of the industry. Old growth is at risk in our low elevation ecosystems. You know, there's a lot of high elevation old growth in, you know, and there's a lot of coastal bog ecosystem. But our low elevation that are the most productive for wildlife, for humans, and you know, the most economical for the forest industry have been heavily hit. This is the Gold Stream River north of Revelstoke, and in green here, these green polygons are all of the cut blocks through time. And so that's, if it's been logged, this is a layer from the provincial government. Green just means it's been logged. And as you can see, the productive low elevation forests are the first to go. And you'll see that pattern in these examples. Yeah. This is St. Mary's Lake, west of Kimberley, Hell Roaring and Lower Angus. So you can see, you know, there's this pattern, right, of we take the low elevation productive forests first and move from there, right? This is Skelly Creek, just west of Creston, in the Goat River area, or sorry, east of Creston in the Goat River area, and they've logged much of this watershed, and that's a place where, you know, old growth would be probably well under 10%, which is extremely risky. This is Perry Creek, just to the southwest of Kimberley. And this is where the southern Purcell caribou herd used to roam. And you can see that, you know, a lot of it was logged historically, and it's there's a reason for that extirpation. This is the lower Spill Machine River, right as it meets the Rocky Mountain Trench, and it's kind of where the rolling fir and spruce forests meet the Rocky Mountain Trench, and you can see these low elevation foothills have been heavily hit. So I just want to address that kind of changing definition of old growth. And, you know, the province has historically had this standardized definition based on age. And the the general rule of thumb is 140 years of age in the interior or in drier ecosystem types, and 250 years of age in those wetter ecosystems, such as the inland temperate rainforest or the coastal temperate rainforests. But the newer definitions for old growth that increasingly are being relied on by scientists and developed are more on the basis of stand structure attributes and ecological processes that drive the stand in the forest. So, those characteristics of old growth forests vary and according to location and tree species. And, I think, however, it's commonly agreed to that they tend to have more standing dead trees, snags, decomposing wood than younger forests. The trees are often larger and the forest canopy is more complex or layered, with openings that allow light, and you get growth of understory vegetation, such as ferns and shrubs and mosses and lichens. So we're going to talk about that. And my goal today is to give you a few tools to think about when you're walking in the forest. And I'm by no means the expert on this, so please feel free to chime in on certain things. And we're hoping to do a few backyard old growth days, a few field visits to old growth close to communities across the Columbia Basin. And we're planning to do that in the summer and fall. And so this is kind of a lead up to that as well. So some of the structural elements of old growth. And I'm going to go through each one of these, but yeah, these are, those structural elements that are increasingly being considered. There's a few others that could be thrown in occasionally, but most of these apply to various ecosystems, whether that's ponderosa pine, montane spruce, or wet coastal or interior temperate rainforest. These characteristics are typically found, and some of them a little more or less in various ecosystems, like say the large trees with broken fork dead tops or large lateral branches. Like you might find that a little more in ponderosa pine or cedar hemlock zones than maybe in montane spruce, but these are generally those principles. So large diameter trees. This is a big ponderosa pine, extremely rare. But yeah, having density of large diameter trees is certainly a characteristic of old growth, and probably the most significant characteristic when people think about old growth. Yeah, and these large ponderosa pines are amongst the most endangered old growth in the province. I think they're at, Rachel Holt's report said they're at well under, so super rare. They were logged in the past for railway ties when they were building the Canadian Pacific Railway. But this is a tree built to endure extremes. And fire scars, branches that only you have high branches so that fire it can evade fire and not burn as significantly, and it's developed those structural attributes to withstand fire. And these trees can be very old, thick barked, and they're extremely resilient. Cedar hemlock, large cedar trees, yeah, large diameter cedar hemlock. I mean, you see this a lot in the inland temperate rainforest and the coastal temperate rainforest, and this would probably be the really upper size class of cedar hemlock. Some of these trees are around 2 meters in diameter. This is an old growth fir and a bit of a mixed stand. Kind of just it would be west of Nelson, and this is a large diameter tree specific, large diameter tree specific to that ecosystem and stand. And this is, old growth, but the biggest trees are maybe in that 55 centimeter diameter range. So when you think about large diameter trees, it really varies by ecosystem. And, so a 60 or 55 centimeter tree in a dry fir forest might be very large, but a 60 centimeter tree in the wet belt or on the coast might be a relatively young tree. So it's site specific. And even within, the same zone, say that the cedar hemlock in the same biogeoclimatic zone, it can differ greatly. And so this is a old growth hemlock stand. Yeah, and they can be very different in terms of the biggest diameter class compared to a more of a cedar leading stand, even when they're relatively at a similar age. Large diameter Douglas fir. This is in an open grassland. A lot of these stands existed throughout the Rocky Mountain Trench. Today, there are very few, and just like the Ponderosa pine ecosystem, this is an ecosystem where fire was very prevalent. You'd have these low severity or relatively low severity fire that was mainly ground fire. You had many nations practicing indigenous cultural burning to enhance these forests and enhance forage and wildlife habitat. So these forests have changed dramatically, not just as a result of logging, but also as a result of not having fire on the landscape. Because they require fire. That's what maintains these stands, and you'd have these these low severity fires every couple of years that would really take out the young trees and kind of create that. Often people describe these Ponderosa or Douglas fir ecosystems as a park-like scene where you have a lot of big trees and it's very open grassland. Sometimes you have balsam root, and also very important places for cultural values as well. Balsam root, very important to nations like the Ktunaxa. Yeah. And today we have kind of these unnatural densities of small trees in a lot of these stands. A transitional stand between Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir and cedar hemlock. These are the large diameter trees in that ecosystem and stand. And then another structural attribute is this multi-layered or multi-storied canopy. And old growth forests have what people refer to as vertical and horizontal structure. And vertical could be described as you know, the trees and the different layers in the vertical structure. So you have different age classes and different heights and different species. So, you know, here you have a lot of large cedar trees and large hemlock trees. And then you also have younger trees coming in, and middle-aged trees. And you just have that kind of family or community within that ecosystem. This is a hemlock forest, and you have that structure where, you know, you have leaning trees, you have large, tall, very tall trees, you have small trees, you have trees with broken forks or broken tops, and you just have that diversity. Horizontal complexity. Broken tops, things like fork trees. You can see here, they've got these unique branches and forks. Devil's Club, where, you know, you get enough light coming through the canopy. You have gaps in the canopy where trees have maybe fallen over, and you get these mounds, and then you get, you know, vegetation that comes out from there. You have nurse logs. And nature is sometimes messy. And I think one of the things that you know, we sometimes forget is it's not uniform. It's it works in, you know, complexity and death and decay, and you know, we as humans like to make rules, and it's messy for sure. This is yeah, cedar hemlock stand with a lot of lichen and macro lichens in the branches and the canopies, and a lot of moss as well. Ponderosa pine, you know, old growth is about complexity, and it's about trees falling over. It's about snags, dead standing trees are what snags are, rotting in place, trees that have weird leans to them, gaps in the canopy that allow, you know, plants and grasses to thrive. Yeah, and again, this is a fire-dominated ecosystem, and that lack of fire definitely threatens these old growth ecosystems, and then, you know, potentially you have catastrophic fire as well, because these stands are very yeah, they have a lot of fuel in them. Yeah, and you know, some of these very large diameter larch forests still exist in places, Western larch, but they also have that complexity of young trees, old trees, and structure as well. This is in the southern Purcells. Another characteristic is large snags, and snags are dead standing trees, and they come in all shapes and sizes, and in all states of decay, from, you know, just recently dead to to the snag you see on the left, to places where beetles and other invertebrates are living in, and depending on that later stage of decay. This is a broken topped ponderosa pine snag, very, very large diameter. And you know, these large diameter snags are one of the characteristics of that old growth structure that we talk about. This is a 8 to 10 foot high fir that was broken off, and it's in a bit more of a later stage of decay. The other side is filled with beetles and decaying wood and etc. And it's also a perfect perch for birds. The next structural feature is large, coarse, woody debris. And so, you have those snags, and then you have, either snags or trees that have fallen down. And that's what coarse woody debris is typically. Large coarse woody debris. It's just essentially trees that have fallen down and are in various stages of decay. And larger pieces of coarse woody debris provide ecological functions that differ from those smaller trees. Those large logs last longer, they hold more moisture, they contribute more organic matter to the soil, and they provide habitat for a greater number of species. And so on the left here you have what was a taller ponderosa pine snag that has fallen down, and now is providing habitats for what are typically referred to as saprophilic species, species that rely on dead and decaying matter, wood. And then on the right, you kind of have your classic inland temperate or coastal temperate rainforests with those large trees that fall over and decay. I didn't want to have to use this shot, but I didn't have a lot of photos of this larger ponderosa pine coarse woody debris. So this is a more advanced decayed snag that has fallen over, and you can see the balsam root all around it, and it's providing that sort of habitat in a ponderosa pine mixed Douglas fir stand. I wanted to address this issue specifically. People often see these pictures of old growth cedar hemlock that have been logged, and think that that's waste, or it's good to transition those stands into new forest. So this cedar has what's referred to as core decay. Internal core decay from fungi species, and there's 25 different species in BC that cause decay in western red cedar. And it's important to recognize that the western red cedars, like this one, can live for hundreds of years with this internal decay caused by fungi. And it's even more important to recognize that death and decay is an incredibly important part of old growth. It's that death and decay is kind of essential to old growth forests. Likely in this particular big western red cedar that's fallen down, there was some sort of advanced internal decay. I would think it snapped and fallen down, but it's playing an extremely valuable role. And I'll show you a shot of it as a nurse log, essentially. And so this is that same tree on the ground. And this large, coarse, woody debris often provides the perfect condition for new growth in an old growth system. You get partial shade, but also more sunlight reaching, the forest floor, because this large cedar and its branches and canopy are no longer there. So often you get these nurse logs that nourish the young trees. And this death and decay is really important to what is, referred to as pit and mound topography that you often see in old growth temperate rainforests. So, you have, say, wind throw, and then you get this uprooted tree, but you have this big pit here. Then you get this decomposing tree, and you get this pit. All that organic matter from the decomposing tree creates this mound, and it provides really ideal growing conditions and nutrients to the soil, and it's really an important part of these old growth systems. And I think the unsung hero in old growth forests is often these species that rely on decaying wood, and they're saprophilic species, invertebrates. Yeah, they are ecosystem engineers, and the presence and diversity of a lot of these species are a good indicator of forest health. And we often overlook insects, and I think people like E.O. Wilson have started to change or transition our understanding of how important the little things are in these ecosystems that shape the big things like old growth forests. So another really good indicator is, having, large trees with broken or forked or dead tops or large lateral branches. And so on the left here, you have this ponderosa snag with a dead top. You've got a large ponderosa as well growing with kind of these branches, large lateral branches as well. And you can see how this ponderosa evades fire as well with very few branches that they begin way up the tree. And on the right here, you have a ponderosa with this broken top as well, and just neat. I think that's often you get character. Old age brings character to the forest and to these trees, and this is that ponderosa pine snag, and you can see it's just an incredible tree that has experienced a lot. And yeah, age, you get these gnarly trees, and this is a old growth cedar hemlock stand in the Seymour River, about 100 kilometers north of Salmon Arm. And you can see there's a bunch of fork topped trees and broken tops and etc. And a lot of these larger cedar snags are often still living below, or some of them are dead, but you can just see that sort of structure and age kind of provides that sort of gnarliness for trees to do what they want, and to grow in interesting and sometimes strange ways. Yeah, another cedar with just kind of that forked or weird branch top right here. Not even the top, only halfway, not even halfway up the tree. But just, yeah, that's definitely one of the attributes. Old growth ponderosa pine, large lateral branches, and you'll see this as you get, above that kind of half height of the tree, or a third quarter up the tree. With a lot of old growth ponderosa pine, you'll see these large lateral branches, and the same thing with a lot of older growth fir as well. So that is kind of all I had on the structural attributes of old growth. I want to address the deferrals, and I think most people think that logging in deferral areas is not going forward. We had the announcement from Minister Conroy back in November that said 2.6 million they intend to protect 2.6 million hectares of old growth in deferral areas, pending discussions with Indigenous nations. Logging in deferral areas, it is happening. In many cases, it's not as well. But the overarching challenge is there are no legal protections in place for deferrals. They rely on companies avoiding them, and also permits approved prior to November 2nd are moving forward in deferral areas. And since November 2nd, the province's own numbers show that around 9,000 soccer fields worth of deferral has been logged since November. Last week, I was in the field with the journalists. I looked at 2 areas north of Revelstoke where deferral has been logged. This block in up Downey Creek, it's a beautiful old growth cedar hemlock stand. Logging began in August of last year. Paused briefly in the fall and continued till January, and continues now. They're hauling most of this wood now, I would think, and upgrading the roads so they can haul all these large cedar and hemlocks out of that forest. And this is irreplaceable inland temperate rainforest that continues to be logged. I don't know what to say beyond that. It's that those stands are not coming back, and they don't come back when you plant them in terms of the structural states. And we also plan to log a lot of these stands in, typically 80 years. That's the rotation cycle once they get converted into stands. Sometimes a bit longer, sometimes 110, but and increasingly in some places quicker as well. And but this is deferral that was logged, and spectacular and kind of tragic as well. The other block that we walked, or that I walked, was logged starting in January. 24 hectares of deferral was and is currently actively being logged, kind of in the Goldstream River area north of Revelstoke. It is critical core high elevation habitat for southern mountain caribou from the North Columbia herd, and that's currently being logged. and it's kind of a transition. I mean, the lower part was a little more cedar hemlock, and the upper part was a bit more spruce and subalpine fir. But large diameter logs, spruce here. But I think the overall message is that we have to fight for these places, and we have to be connected to these places, and we have to also understand what we're losing. And environmental victories don't magically happen. It takes commitment and passion and time from people caring and fighting for those places. And a few opportunities. Next week, we're launching a campaign to raise awareness and help protect the Inland Temperate Rainforest. So if you're not on our mailing list, please do sign up. If you don't follow us on Facebook or Twitter, or Instagram, please do follow us, and we'll have this campaign that I'm really excited about on the Inland Temperate Rainforest and old growth as well. And that'll be next week. And the other opportunity I wanted to tell people about, this summer and fall, we're going to be doing old growth field tours in various communities, and dates are still to be determined. But it's one of the reasons we wanted to talk about the structural attributes of old growth, so that when you come on these tours, your mind will, instantly go, wow, look at the of large coarse woody debris pieces over 50 centimeters, but no, but I hope that, this can slightly, you can think about some of those things when you're in a forest, and whether they might apply, and whether some of those old growth characteristics might apply to the forest you're looking at. But yeah, those field tours I'm really excited about, and I think they're going to start in mid-June, and then go from there into the fall and in various communities across the Columbia Basin. And yeah, it's just it's one thing to talk about it. It's another thing to see it, and I think that's what really helps to connect people to these places and fight for them as well. So that is all I have in terms of a presentation. Okay, first question from Sarah. What are they replanting is not the makeup of an ITR forest, correct? Yeah. A lot of the companies plant, say, 6 or 7 species in the Inland Temperate Rainforest, when, a lot of those stands would only have 2 or 3, and you'd have cedar, hemlock, spruce, maybe a little bit of fir once in a while, some white pine, depending on the stand and the aspect, in those low elevation stands, I should say. And we're often replanting with, the things the forest industry wants to harvest in 80 years. So that's the focus. I mean, there is an ecological lens, but you plant what you want to harvest and what you want to grow, because it's more of a tree farm once you replace those stands. And so, you see a lot of that in a lot of the low elevation stands where there's a lot of, say, spruce, where historically there would have been these big cedar and hemlocks. And you see it, right? We plant a lot of trees and then go back in and thin. And we don't also rely on natural regeneration for most of the forests in BC, and do our silviculture in a way that would allow for that natural regeneration, because we want to get trees in the ground, because they're the future timber supply, and the annual allowable cut is predicated on that. Okay. Awesome. Thanks, Jen. Oh, who is us? I guess that's a Wildsight is us. Yeah, and that's, please do follow us at Wildsight, and sign up on our mailing lists on our website, wildsight.ca. Name of creek. I assume that's referring to. I assume that's referring to where that logging and the deferrals happening. So there was 2 stands there. One was on the south side of Downey Creek, a road that's called off of the Hemlock Road. The other was off of the Devil's Garden Road in the Goldstream River area. So right at the start of the Goldstream, and previously that was an area you would consistently, the caribou would often be in those neck of the woods and up high, and in places like Caribou Basin. They're less so there now, for whatever reason. What do you think of spraying for hemlock looper? Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. I think often the disturbant agent in a lot of these stands is hemlock, right? And it's small, or hemlock looper, and it's small scale disturbance that's been happening to individual trees. And so yeah, I don't like really spraying for hemlock looper, because yeah, that's a natural ecological process, and maybe climate change will change that, like we've seen with other pests, but or not pests, insects and other diseases, but I haven't seen evidence of that. Okay. I think, what was the name of the first? Yeah, I think, does anyone else have any more questions?
Eddie, so I'm trying to get the names of the places north of Revelstoke, the 2 places. So, and then you said the off Devil something road in the Goldstream, but I didn't catch the full name.
Yeah, Devil's Garden. Devil's
Garden Road, and that's turn off quite soon, but up higher.
Yeah, that's all up high. It's at about 1,400 meters. It starts. Yeah.
Okay, and the other one is the south side of Downey Creek off Hemlock Creek.
Hemlock Road, yeah.
Hemlock Road. Okay. Is that frequented by caribou as well?
Yeah, I don't think as much anymore, just because the South Columbia herd, the Downey is kind of the divider between the South and North Columbia herd. Right. I think less so these days, and that one's pretty low. Yeah, I think they were more up Sorcerer and a little further up the Downey, historically.
We saw some on the road again this year.
Yeah, right at Caribou.
Yeah, repeatedly. They're there every year, but they were there again this year.
Totally. And they're probably calving now.
Yeah, there were a couple of younger looking ones.
Totally.
Yeah, like they weren't for yeah, anyway.
That's awesome. Jen asked, any great books you would recommend for reading more about old growth nature politics. Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite authors is Seth Kantner. He's an Alaskan writer. He talks a lot about caribou, and his book Ordinary Wolves is just like one of my favorite books ever written.
Can you say the title again, Eddie?
Totally, yeah, Seth Kantner, and it's Kantner.
And the book title?
Ordinary Wolves. That's one of my favorite books. Yeah, he grew up on the North Slope of Alaska, and just has a very special connection to caribou and to the the places he writes about his home. Yeah, and I mean, Timber Wars podcast, NPR did this incredible podcast on the timber wars in America, the Pacific Northwest, that brought about the Northwest Forest Plan. Yeah, that's a phenomenal podcast and phenomenal listen, and I think it's very relevant to BC. I mean, there's lots of great, phenomenal books out there. We could spend all day on that. Yeah, Suzanne Simard's Finding the Mother Tree, and I think that's going to be a film as well, and I think that's going to really help propel old growth in BC too, having that on such a large global stage. The carbon sequestration piece. Yeah. Is it true that the provincial government doesn't account for carbon emissions from forestry in their carbon accounting system? Yeah, it is true that they're not properly accounting for carbon emissions from forestry, and are kind of choosing what emissions to count. And one of the things we know is that a lot of these, old growth systems do sequester a lot of carbon, and they're really important for carbon storage, and particularly, places like the Inland Temperate Rainforest and the Coastal Temperate Rainforest. And when you log those places, you're losing a lot of the carbon, 65 to 70%, even when you consider long-term wood storage in those ecosystems. So, I did a calculation one time using just 600 hectares of inland temperate rainforest that was going to be logged, and using the average carbon storage of those forests. And immediately it was something like 200,000 tons of hectares were going to be lost with that 600 hectares being logged. And even when you account for carbon storage in wood products. And that's something we don't properly account for in our accounting whatsoever. Yeah, and we'll be sending out a recording for anyone who missed the first bit of this presentation, and to share with folks who missed this today. Please keep an eye out for our new campaign. The secret's out next week, and maybe we need a Wildsight book club as well. I think people would be stoked on that. Awesome. Well, yeah, you can always follow up with me. My email is it's just Eddie, EDDIE, at wildsight.ca. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. And yeah, awesome.